So Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. We'd like to welcome you to this session. Our speaker today is Dr. Maryam Razvi Padella. I chose to moderate this session because I had the honor of meeting her 4 years ago on a trip to South Africa. And we had discussed some of the research she was doing towards her EDD. And I was so happy to see that she'd completed it. And she'll be sharing with us some of what she's learned. Dr. Padella is an educator and researcher. Her interests include investigating pedagogy used while teaching and learning about religion. Her dissertation was titled The Representation and Mediation of Religion in Social Studies Classrooms and Textbooks. Sister Maryam also holds teaching certifications in pre-K to 6th grade, and her teaching background includes work in public, private, and weekend schools. Her education includes a BA in Religious Studies with a minor in Elementary Education, a master's in Teaching and Curriculum, and her EDD is in Teaching and Curriculum. We want to welcome you, Sister Maryam. Jazakumullah khair.
Thank you so much, Sister Magda. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this morning. Today's session is titled Towards Building a Resilient Faith, Foundational Concerns about Atheism and the Path Forward. And I'm hoping, inshallah, it dovetails well with an earlier session, I think yesterday, with one of the scholars from Yaqeen Institute who also was discussing some of the challenges that youth are facing in today's environment. I will be perfectly honest with you. When I was approached about working on this project, I wasn't entirely convinced that this was a hot topic that really needed to be addressed. But the more that I've gotten into it, through the background research, through reading what scholars and imams and parents and the different concerns that people have, I've become more and more convinced that we really need to take the time to reflect and think about this question in a deeper way. So I'm hoping that this presentation, it's by no means an exhaustive idea on the path forward, but hopefully some preliminary thoughts. So with that, let's begin. I'm hoping in today's session to do the following. One, I'm going to explain to you some of the background that led to what I will share at the very end, which is kind of a scope and sequence for elementary through high school grade levels. But before we go to the scope and sequence, we need to understand what the problem is, the nature of it, and what are the challenges. I'm going to share with you in summary of those challenges some emerging themes that I found in the research I did that really help us articulate and identify the challenges that our youth are facing. And then I'm also going to talk to you most importantly about a path forward. So here's the problem. What do we do? I have a few ideas, inshallah. And hopefully I'm hoping we will be able to have a robust question and answer session and discussion at the end of the session, inshallah. So the goal here is to basically provide some principles and the hope that teachers can take some of the ideas I'm sharing here and make them more specific to your own context. Obviously, when you're teaching, over the course of a year, the teacher is the one who gets to know the students very well, the 20 to 30 students that are in front of you. So what I'm starting with is the principles so that you can use those to inform your own teaching, inshallah. So one of the reasons that we, and actually I should have mentioned that my work was also sponsored by AMJA. And so they approached me with this idea. And one of the reasons that they did embark on this journey was because imams, especially those who are affiliated in a masjid that has an attached school, have been receiving all sorts of really important queries and concerns from parents about their children, dealing with children and the challenges they face, and ultimately, in some cases, unfortunately, children not identifying as being Muslim, feeling that Islam isn't meaningful to them, or just being out of the faith entirely. We've also had observations and challenges that families face. I remember when I was teaching, I would have parents come to me with a 14, 15-year-old and say, can you talk to so-and-so? Can you help deal with, drugs, a lot of things that people don't think are happening in the community that are actually happening, that can lead children down a road that ultimately leads to them out of the faith. And so as Islamic school teachers, that's a primary concern, because one of the reasons that parents, such as myself, I send some of my kids to Islamic schools, one of the key reasons that we do so is because this Islamic identity is of the utmost importance to us, and we want to have them be taught in a community that respects that faith, that emphasizes it, and helps them kind of protect their faith and grow it as well. And actually, on the point of growing faith, I just want you to keep in mind through this presentation that one of the things I see in my mind is that faith is like a skill that you learn. So for example, if you've learned to ride a bike when you're young, when you're older, even if a certain amount of time has elapsed, when you go back to ride that bike, it kind of comes back to you, right? It's just ingrained. So faith is something akin to that, right? We need to think about how we can help kids exercise their faith muscle. And that's something I'm going to come back to as we go on. And on a personal background level, I have 4 kids. I have 1 teenager and a preteen. And as you'll see, that time period of the teenage, the preteen, that's of particular concern. And then as you were told earlier, my academic interests really are how do we teach about religion? My field work I did in a public high school, and I was looking specifically at how teachers incorporate all sorts of approaches to teach about Christianity, Islam, and other Abrahamic faiths. So let's begin. So I started in the data because, as I said, I wasn't familiar with this question or the problem, and my inclination with my academic background is to always just start reading. And I started reading everything, not just items about Muslim youth, but because, to be honest with you, there isn't that much, so I decided to look at correlating faiths. So I looked at initially articles from Yaqeen Institute. They have a really well-developed set of resources. Articles such as this one, the concerns about atheism that a lot of Christians have. And then there was some peer-reviewed research about how do people of faith become atheists, right? And then surveys, how teens are losing their faith in droves. What's going on? This is also kind of, that was an article that was applicable across multiple faiths. The next one, Tomorrow's Gods, what's the future of religion? So this question of atheism isn't just one that is of concern to Muslims, it's concern to people of a lot of different faiths. And there's a little bit of comfort in that because there are other resources that we can look at and develop and make them more appropriate for our particular audience. And then there's also something called an organization called the Islamic Education and Research Academy. They have an incredible amount of resources, particularly online and at YouTube. One of their core resources and speakers is, he wrote this book actually, which I will talk about in a little bit, Sheikh Hamza. He has gone very deep into the arguments that atheists make and has been able to respond to them on an intellectual level. And this book that he's written, is an invaluable resource, as are his videos on YouTube. But his arguments are very intellectual and they're at a very high caliber. So what I tried to do later on in this presentation is take his book and break it down and see, okay, where can we as elementary and high school teachers take some of those things, simplify them, and use them as building blocks so that we can develop these kind of intellectual skills in our own students. We do have a weird social context in the United States, I should mention, in that most people categorize the United States overall as a very religious country. But oddly, if you look at the second half of it, it says over half of Americans believe in some form of heaven and hell and participate in their religious practice weekly, but at the same time are uninformed about their theology, include other theology and their own, which is really interesting. So there is this emotional attachment to faith and to having faith, but people remain uninformed. They don't have, their faith muscle is weak. And so, and in addition to that, and perhaps as a result of that weak faith muscle, the number of those who consider themselves agnostic or atheist is growing. And this is, again, all over. This is not just for Muslims, this is for all sorts of faith communities. And there are some interesting economic correlations, and I just mentioned that as a side point, because while faith and the atheist kind of tendency is growing, faith tends to grow when people are in an economic downturn. So because faith is a sign of hope, it's a source of strength to people who are really struggling. And I just think that's really interesting. I always remember there's this hadith about the Prophet ﷺ being concerned about wealth for his ummah and the effect of wealth in his ummah. And I think that's just something to keep in the back of our mind, you know, that that I think that when people aren't economically well off, they have a greater need, and people feel when they're more wealthy, they're a little bit more self-sufficient and don't have a greater need. So we need to actually do more work to articulate for our students and to exemplify for them the need that we all have for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in our lives. So there were 4 main emerging themes from the research that I did. And so this is based on what students reported. I'm a big believer in starting with the students first and not going top down. So I wanted to hear from students, and you'll see in the presentation, I'm going to try and include a lot of quotes from some of the ones that really spoke to me, the ones that really hit my heart. I'm going to share those. And I think that will help us identify with the students' struggles. So one of them is that foundation is key. I will go into this more. The second one is that hypocrisy matters. The third is that the real influencers are personal relationships. And then lastly, that we need to learn, and our children need to learn how to fail. And while we're talking as, yes, people who are role models and teachers and administrators in the school environment, I think one of the things we need to remember, which is why you have the paper with you, is that we're also on a journey of faith. And I think that we also need to take a minute to just remember that we've struggled with our faith as well, and that we need to reflect on that and bring those experiences into our work with the children in front of us. And we had actually done this, I'd written the scope and sequence almost a year ago, and I've come back to it for the purposes of this presentation. And I really have been thinking about it a lot over the past year. And so when I looked at the 4 themes that emerged, and I did this piece recently, this piece of reflecting, and you're going to see that also reflected in my presentation. I'm going to take a minute to model where I felt that all of those themes hit home for me, inshallah. And I hope that that will be of benefit. And I would like you also to take that minute as I'm going through the presentation to write down on your piece of paper, and inshallah, if anyone is willing to share with us later, what was a critical moment for you in your own faith development? I think that when we are young, you know, we are very happily Muslim, or happily whatever our parents raise us to be. And it is very natural, both in child development and just as you know, as people, that there comes a moment, it might likely be in high school or as a young adult, where we have to accept and embrace the faith that we were presented with as a gift as children. We have to decide to what degree we're going to make it ours. And that's always a really pivotal moment in people's lives, and it definitely was in mine. And again, I hope that people will be willing to share some of the things that really were influential on them. So on this theme of foundation is key, people who usually experience a crisis of faith happen to be in high school or in their early adulthood, so in their college years. And I found that a very, very interesting finding, because the Prophet ﷺ, he gave us this advice, and it's so interesting how it dovetails with the social science research. He said, play with them for the first part, then teach them for the next 7, and then advise them for the next 7 years. Okay, so we're playing for 1 to 7 years of age, teaching from 7 to 14, and then where are we? We are in those magical, challenging, hard high school years. They're 14, and actually early adulthood. 14 to 21 are the last 7 years. And the Prophet ﷺ advises us at that point to advise them. So we're not really teaching, teaching is not the right word. We're working with them. We are helping them exercise that muscle, trying to find the real world implications of what their faith means to them in their life. But that foundation that we lay in those early childhood years, so from that 1 to about 14 years, is a key defense. It's like a fortress. So, and there were two strands of thought when it came to the data that I found. One is that some of the challenges that children face are intellectual, because they don't know how to deal with an intellectual problem, or challenges of the heart. So you'll see me make this talk about these two categories as we go along. So intellectually, for the mind, knowledge acquired earlier can be a helpful defense against challenging ideas. So for example, we hear a lot about jihad, hot topics, right? Well, if our kids know what the rules of jihad are, then they can actually converse about it intelligently, without being simplistic and saying, well, Islam is a religion of peace. They can have a robust discussion about different things. But also the heart is very important, because there's an emotional connection to our faith. That's why we are people of faith. Sister Noor is a very courageous public speaker who has shared, I think there's a lot of videos on YouTube that she has put out. She is a Syrian American, and she was raised as a Muslim, but lost her faith and came back to it eventually, alhamdulillah. But she has been very brave in really talking about her experiences and sharing a lot of personal reflections. And one of the things that she said that really stuck with me is that if they had only taught me to love Allah before fearing Allah. So while we're talking about a faith muscle and helping students exercise it, and yes, having the knowledge about it, we have to understand and appreciate that we have emotional connections to our faith. And in fact, one of the students, the participants, one of the other studies who mentioned losing her faith, it was actually a lot of it was about the emotional association she had. Her father had really enforced their, I think, Christian faith practice at home, but was a very strident person and harsh. And as soon as he died, she left the faith, because she felt that the faith was this kind of association that she had with her emotional recollection about her father. So we want our kids' emotional associations with their faith to be positive ones, ones that as adults, when they have the freedom and ability to make their own choices in life, that they will remember what it feels like to be Muslim, and they will come back. So some of the implications, and we will go into these in more detail in a bit, but just to introduce the ideas. So the implications for the lower and upper elementary from this emerging theme would be to focus on the heart. So this idea of gratitude as a habit. One of the things that was identified by Hamza sources is that gratitude is a source of proper worship, and that arrogance is the opposite of feeling of self-sufficiency. So when we think about gratitude and the things that it does to our heart, it gives our heart a positive feeling. It gives our heart a thankfulness, and this idea that we're dependent, so that we're always creating this link to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the role that He plays in our lives. This idea of arrogance, which I touched on earlier, and not necessarily arrogance, but this idea of self-sufficiency, more importantly, is also the idea that comes into play when, for example, I mentioned this idea that people who are economically struggling have an easier time being faithful than people who might feel because of their wealth they are self-sufficient. So as teachers and administrators in schools, developing the opposite, the sense of gratitude, helps students kind of build up their ability to defend against the feeling of self-sufficiency and arrogance. And for the mind, as I said before, this is, the point about building that foundational knowledge about religion. So yes, prayer, but what does prayer mean? Like, we need to also make sure that when I say foundational knowledge, it's not just a how-to manual, it's really understanding why are we doing these things. There's so many of us that pray Surah Fatiha and we don't have a good understanding of it. We don't have an understanding of what it means when we're engaged in Salah. So when I say foundational knowledge, like really understanding. And then for the upper grades, I would suggest, based on this finding, to focus on appreciating ourselves, Allah, and the community. So taking the gratitude building block from earlier in the grade levels and taking it one step forward. So appreciating the gift that Allah SWT has provided us with just the fact that we are alive and that we are unique, and that the fact that Allah SWT has so many different attributes that play a role in our life, appreciating those, and then appreciating the community that we've been given. And then for our intellect, or for the children's intellect at that point, solving problems that make sense to them with principles from the Deen. And as we were chatting earlier, Sister Magda, you were talking about even the fourth graders are coming up with questions or ideas or thoughts, challenges that you might expect from a high school level. We need to engage students. We need to have classrooms. And actually, we can think about that for a minute. What does that mean for the classroom, right? If I'm saying solve problems, this is not a classroom as a one-way street. I'm the teacher, you just sit and listen. This is really garnering information from students and working with them. So a classroom community where there are rules of engagement and people can discuss cooperatively. On this point about foundation is key, as I was saying to you earlier, I spent some time reflecting on my own high school experience. And I will be frank and tell you that I grew up in a very suburban community. I was one of the only brown Muslim kids in my school. And for the majority of my schooling experience, I didn't like talking about me being brown or the fact that I was Muslim. In fact, I used to hide it. So I didn't wear hijab or anything like that. One year of my high school experience, I went to a Catholic school. And that was a very interesting experience because these are people who were, if they were not practicing, the students who went there, they were at least respectful of the nuns who went there. They attended mass. There was this kind of open conversation about religion. And we used to go to theology class. And remember, coming into this experience, I was hiding my Muslimness. Like, don't talk to me about it. I'm not engaging. But something happened in theology class when I was 14 years old that made me go, oh, I need to take another look at this thing called Islam. Because we were in theology class and we would have the Bible with us because this is one of the key texts that we were using. And I cannot explain to you my mortification when other students would take the Bible and put it on the floor. I could not stomach it. I felt this deep urge within me to run around the classroom and pick up everyone's books and put them on top of a desk. But why? Because it had been ingrained to me as a child that when you had the Mus'haf, and we'd always been taught, right? Okay, we have the Quran, but there are the Torah, the Zabur, the Injil, right? These are all holy books. And this idea of honoring the book had been ingrained to me. We, as I'm sure so many families had, these intricately designed Mus'haf covers, and I would be annoyed as a 6-year-old. The Quran, something would happen to my mom, would be like, go pick it up, kiss it, touch it to your forehead, go put it on a shelf. And I was like, oh my God, relax. But when it came to me being 14 and seeing those Bibles on the floor, the adab that I was taught as a child came back and was full force in my face, and something I could not ignore. And the more I thought about why I was feeling so strongly about these Bibles on the floor, I realized it was because of the adab that we have, or we've been taught to have for our Mus'haf. And I started to actually appreciate it at that point. When I was younger, it was kind of annoying because like she was always after me about putting the cover back on, putting it up on a shelf, kissing it, touching it to my forehead and putting it on the shelf. But as a high school student, it became a moment of internal recognition and teaching. And I just want to share that with you because these are the types of things that when faced with a different experience, our children, inshallah, might be able to come back to. This one, no one likes a hypocrite. No one likes hypocrisy. So I know that when I write hypocrisy matters, everyone's going to be like, yeah, so what? Of course it does. But the thing is, I don't think we always realize how incredibly perceptive students are and how much they are listening. They are listening to everything. And in fact, even in my fieldwork that I did in a public school, looking at this finding, I recalled that there was a student who missed an interview that he was supposed to be in with me. And I was really annoyed. I was like, look, we've tried to reschedule this multiple times. What happened? He was an African-American student. And I point that out, you'll see there's a reason. He was an African-American student. And he said to me, look, I was in detention. I was in detention for like a week. And I was like, can I ask why? And he's like, well, I didn't do what they think I did, but I was in detention. And I was like, well, if you didn't do what they think you did, why were you in detention? Why didn't you say something? He said to me, and it has stuck with me for the last 9 years. He said to me, they wouldn't believe me anyways. And because he felt that the administrators and teachers in his school wouldn't have believed him anyways. And I have to tell you, this kid, I had been watching him for 4 weeks. He is one of the most charming young adults I had ever met in my life. Everyone loved him. I mean, I could not believe that a child of this caliber had the perception that no one would believe him anyways. And so he didn't stand up for himself. There are conversations and things that we have about students, or when we don't think they're in earshot, that give them different impressions. And so I point out that story because we need to recognize how perceptive they are. They pick up on our vibes. They pick up on our conversations. And that also comes to our faith, right? So this one student said, Christianity is something that if you really believed it, it would change your life and you would want to change the lives of others. I haven't seen too much of that. They're watching us. They are watching us. They're perceptive and they're watching us. And they want to see what change is your deen making in your life. You're talking to me about sadaqah, you're talking to me about prayer 5 times a day, but Miss So-and-so, Mr. So-and-so, I see you hauling out of the musalla. You know, I see you outside of school because we live in the same community. I see how you interact with people outside the community. And then along with that, we need to consider these two ideas of irrelevance and not having a connection. Sometimes, and this is also not relevant just to Muslim students, but a lot of the Christian students that were in some of the studies I read, what they're talking to me in Bible study class, it doesn't mean anything to me. It's not important for my life. It's not connected to me. It doesn't matter to me. How are our khutbahs? And especially for our schools that are affiliated with masjids, we have kids sometimes learn to do khutbahs themselves, or they're listening to khutbahs. Are they tuning out? Is the khutbah offering them anything? Or are kids listening to us adults singing, I don't know what planet these adults are on, because here are the problems I'm facing, and they want me to turn to Islam, but they're not talking about it. The adults aren't recognizing that XYZ is a problem for me. So I don't need to listen to this. I don't need to pay attention to it. It doesn't mean anything. It's irrelevant. So one of the studies that was done in the Yaqeen Institute had this to say, and this was really just, as a parent, very scary. That these scholars that were cited in the study said that if the parents themselves are not involved in religious activities, if their actions are not consistent with what they preach, the children are rarely motivated to follow in their parents' religious footsteps. And this is really important, I think, because I know that Islamic schools have a lot of responsibility and they embrace that, but there's also, sometimes a disconnect between the school and the home. And I think that we just need to have more conversation within the community about what it means to actually raise Muslim children with a strong faith muscle. And actually, I have to just add one little anecdote here. I had a cousin who was in a Hifz school, and this was a Hifz school that he went and stayed at. And and this moment happened about 30 years ago. I've never forgotten it. We were sitting in a car. This child was talking about something he learned in school, and he was sharing it with his parents in a moment of enthusiasm and wanting to share what he learned. And his mother turned to him and said, "You leave the school stuff for school. This is home." These types of things are really problematic. We cannot expect one standard for our students and another standard for ourselves. And this also applies to other community leaders. I mean, if we think that kids aren't watching our imams, masjid board members, I was on a masjid board once, we all know what happens and the challenges that they face, that they're not watching the principals or the administrators and the teachers, they're watching us. And it has an effect. Our behavior has a really, really powerful effect. Because as adults, if our faith isn't playing a role in our life, they're not going to feel that it needs to play a role in theirs. So for this finding, for the lower and upper elementary, we would focus on developing, again, the heart. So building this knowledge about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because yes, humans are fallible, right? And so I thought to myself, well, how do we strengthen the faith muscle against this kind of, not hypocrisy, but just, the mistakes that we make sometimes, right? Well, we help the kids focus on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will never disappoint. We know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most knowledgeable, the most wise. He's never going to show them the wrong example. So we need to build this relationship, this emotional attachment that they have to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his attributes. Intellectually, we need to build on them an akhira focus. That, okay, we're all, that's the idea of we are all struggling, that we're all moving towards a shared goal, which is the akhira, and that's what we need to have in focus. Not so much just trying to take the load and the burden off of the people in our lives, right? This idea that we're all struggling, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not fail you, and we need to have our eyes on the so-called prize, the akhira. For middle and high school students, I would focus for the heart on building a love and deeper knowledge about the Prophet ﷺ, because he's someone that has lived a life that we know so much about. his Sahaba's lives we know so much about. And for this particular age group, there's a lot of correlation here between seeing, for teachers to help students recognize, how did the Prophet ﷺ address XYZ? What were, and not just, okay, he, we can't say, oh, well, he thought about climate change, but yes, there are principles in the Prophet ﷺ's lives that are applicable to some of the things that our children are facing. So we need to take a principle approach, a framework approach, and take those ideas from his life and bring it to the students. And just building a personal relationship with the Prophet ﷺ. And intellectually, honestly, how to deal with the news. And this was something that also came up in my fieldwork in high schools, where students would write in their work, well, they would have to write like a daily reflection. And they would write things like, well, we hear Islam is a religion of peace, but I watched the news yesterday and so happened, right? Then there's a lack of connection. There's a chasm between what you might hear on the news and how you might interpret it, and what we teach about Islam, or what we teach about any religion, but really Islam is one that comes in the news, and there's always this association between, with the crisis, with harm, and all of these things. And our children are listening to that same news, and we're talking to them in school in ideal fashion, but they need to really know how to deal with that. So I will say this idea of, and this actually is, I'm really glad about the talk that's coming next, because I think this is a particular idea is going to carry well into that one. Sorry, Sheikh Saad. So this idea of walking the talk, or walking the walk, I don't know, whatever way you want to put it. I will share with you that when like I said to you before, when I was up until the point when I was in high school, don't talk to me about being Muslim. I'm not even brown. I don't want to deal with it. And the thing is that whole thing was problematic for me, even in Sunday school. And I don't know why people always want to talk to girls about hijab. Like that is, just like a core issue. And I had a lot of Sunday school teachers that would bring this idea up, and it always stuck with me that when I saw them outside of school, guess what? We would go to family, friend, like social gatherings together. They weren't wearing the hijab. Why are you telling me to wear a hijab when I see you don't wear a hijab? Like, just don't talk to me about it, right? Like, as a very opinionated teenager. But it takes one teacher. And I had this one teacher around that same time. I was 14, 15 years old. The same year I went to the Catholic high school. And she was young. And this is not like an ageist thing. I mean, she was just, had a very open way of talking about things. And she was brutally honest with us about her life, about her own experiences, about where she went wrong, how it made her feel, and she did everything she said she thought we should do. I knew her socially. I watched her because I was always testing people, and guess what? Our kids are testing people. They are, if we think that we're administering tests to them, they are administering the harshest test to us. Okay, and I watched her like a hawk. I watched her, how she interacted with people. I watched her wear hijab outside of school. And guess what? She was the only teacher that I had in Sunday school that wore hijab in the masjid and outside the masjid. Guess what I ended up doing that year? I ended up wearing the hijab, not necessarily because of her. There were a whole lot of things that happened in my life that made it possible, but that was a really, really important building block. And I share that with you just as part of this reflection piece that I hope you guys are keeping up with, that when we approach these different themes, please take a minute to, if you can, to write down something that kind of hits home from your own experience. So we know influencers, Instagram, it's important, but the real influencers are our personal relationships. And I don't just mean interpersonally with our friends, You know, we can have, or we should have a relationship with the Quran. We should have this, in personal relationships, I'm also going to apply it to this idea of emotional attachment. You know, we should have a relationship with the Prophet ﷺ. We should have emotional attachment to him, to the companions. And I just don't mean in an ideal way. I will say one time I was teaching and I asked my kids who were about 13, you know, who's your role model? And they were all like, oh, Sister Maryam, it's the Prophet ﷺ. And I was like, listen, guys, I saw that poster of 50 Cent in your folders. So let's do a Venn diagram. I want to see how much you really do love and know, right? Because when you love someone, you know about them. So we did a Venn diagram, 50 Cent on one side, the Prophet ﷺ on the other side. And I said, tell me what you know. I learned so much about 50 Cent that day. I learned about his kid. I learned about his tattoos. I learned about the number. I'm literally teaching this class in the Musalla, and I'm like, oh my God, anyone who walks by is going to be like, what is she talking about? But they shared all of this stuff with me. They shared where his tattoos are. They shared the number of them. I also learned about how many times he had been shot, you know, where he'd been shot, I learned, so many things about 50 Cent, right? So our kids build relationships with abstract people as well, not just their friends. They have, I mean, she's literally carrying a poster of 50 Cent in her Islamic school folder. They have an emotional attachment. How can we cultivate the right type of emotional and personal attachments, right? So here's one that's the right kind. You know, this student from one of the articles I read said, we all know when it's time to pray, and if we forget, we remind each other. Community is an integral part of that equation. Okay, so that's really important. Yes, your social environment is also really important. Or are their friends telling them, hey, you know, it's not a big deal. You can pray later, you can do this later, whatever. But the idea is overall relationships and emotional attachments are key. So what relationships do we have a deep attachment to? And what relationships do our students have deep attachments to? So for lower and upper elementary, this might include focusing on the heart and building our relationship to Allah, right? And in this, taking the earlier building block where I mentioned this idea, taking it one step forward and looking at nature, right? Appreciating Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you know, through the things that he has revealed to us in nature and created for us, and things that are just very difficult for us to understand. We're at the Grand Canyon right now, and we're looking at this big canyon, and it's mind-blowing. You know, there's so many things we don't understand. How did this happen? It's just inexplicable. But when we experience that sense of wonder, it's a really powerful experience, because we're also showing this is our part of our reliance and relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I would also argue that building a relationship with Surah Fatiha at this age level is really important. Surah Fatiha, I mean, we can calculate how many times a day we recite it. It's a core part of our prayer. It's a core dua. You know, we need to have a relationship with our kids, need to have a relationship with it. Intellectually, understanding this idea of cause and effect, understanding that things happen for a reason. This is something that you can build on if you start early. You can build on to the more intellectual arguments that people make for atheism. And I realize I'm running short on time, so I'm going to try to speed up. And also looking at the signs of the day, judgment, to maintain that akhira focus I talked about before. For middle and high school students, it would be to focus on the heart with this idea of, again, building the relationship with the Prophet ﷺ, his family, and the Sahaba, and intellectually thinking about knowledge about you know, why we're here, what makes sense, you know, why it doesn't make sense actually for us not to have a purpose in our creation. And so I will at this point do my piece of reflection and say, as a child, I remember reading a lot of stories about the Prophet ﷺ, and I'm an only child, so I don't have siblings, and I spent a lot of time kind of on my own. But this was part of the Prophet ﷺ's life that really stuck with me. This idea that he was an only child, that he was an orphan, that he was, you know, like he went through so much more, like in this idea of adjusting and what. But I always felt like, the Prophet ﷺ would understand how I'm feeling right now, because there was no one in my cousins or my social group who was an only child. But I always felt, because of the stories I read about the Prophet ﷺ, as a child, I always had this idea with me that he would have understood. My parents don't understand. My father's from a family of 14, my mom's from a family of 9. But who would have understood? The Prophet ﷺ. And this was always a core part of my emotional attachment to him. And then this idea of learning how to fail. So the thing is, we need to have a way for students to think about how to deal with failure, because a lot of people talked about, my dua wasn't answered. Maybe maybe that means, I'm not worthy. Maybe that means XYZ. We need to give students a way to interpret what they perceive an unanswered dua, for example, or feeling undeserving or shy or hesitant of going to the masjid. Our masjids are really, really, really important. These are centers where our children and our students should be able to go and feel accepted, should be able to, and actually one of the reasons I loved going to ISNA when I was younger, especially, was because I felt I could go and I didn't have to explain anything. I didn't have to explain halal food to anyone. I didn't have to explain why I'm wearing the hijab. We're all wearing hijab or whatever. And it was just such a sense of comfort. So our masjid should be that sense of comfort. And I mentioned masjids again because we have a lot of interaction with our students in the masjid, because there is a lot of connection between the schools and those places. A lot of people struggle with this idea of bad things happening as a punishment. This idea of why are bad things happening? Why are there tragedies? Why is evil around? How do I interpret it? This is a really important point to recognize, because this is also one of the main arguments that people who are atheists talk about. This idea of where does evil come from, and why would a good God allow evil or bad things to happen? So we need to be able to, especially in those older grade levels, after we've kind of built up this muscle of understanding how to interpret things, this idea of working through problems with students through conversation and exchange of ideas. I'm going to try and speed up, I'm sorry. So the implications for the lower and elementary would be to be able to find the positive. So it's not an unanswered dua, Allah SWT is saving it for you, or he's protecting you from something. Because remember, he's all wise. He knows, right? He knows what's better. This idea intellectually, there are other forces at work, and maybe there is something that you need to just wait for, to just be patient. For middle and high school students, focusing on reflecting on the akhirah. So you think this is a failure, but guess what? Just keep the real success in mind, right? So really developing the akhirah focus muscle. And then, because we've already done the work earlier of trying to build a relationship and knowledge about the prophets and the Sahaba and the Prophet's family, learning how they dealt with tragedy and setback, right? Because that's a good model for them. Now, I'm not going to share any personal reflections about failures, because, everyone's shy about sharing their mistakes, but obviously we all know that we've made mistakes, we've had failures, and we need to have this approach that, we need to have plan A, plan B, plan C, and also recognizing who is the best of planners, right? Okay, I understand. I might have had this idea in my mind. I wanted to do it, but Allah SWT got this. I'm just going to make dua. And because I recognize that, we need to also see the positive of how can failure lead to an increased sense of tawakkul, an increased sense of trusting in Allah SWT. That is really, really important for our students. Some of the bigger arguments that we kind of hinted at that atheists make is this idea of, isn't science awesome? It's the explanation for so many things. For some people, that's one of those big arguments, that the things that we worked on through the elementary and high school years that we hope that our students will be able to deal with. This idea, like I said, why does God allow evil or bad things to happen, right? We need to build those faith muscles so that when it comes to having these types of arguments posed to them in places like high and college, our students can deal with that. This idea of the God of the gaps. This is an argument that a lot of atheists make, that it's just so easy to answer unknowns by saying, okay, it's just God, right? So that's just weak. And I'm gonna actually just share this is the book I mentioned. If you want to write the name, this is a very useful book. And a lot of the ideas that I showed, I'm gonna just skip ahead and show these last slides, and we'll open it up to discussion. I can touch on different things. And then I actually took the chapters of the book, the themes that we talked about, and the ideas that I shared about different grade levels, and I created the scope and sequence going from kindergarten to 12th grade. So what you see on the top is kind of the thread of the focusing on the emotion or the heart. The key themes are like gratitude, all those attributes, self-love, faith in action. And the words underneath there, merciful God, free slave, those are all correlate to chapters in the book that I just showed you pictures of as a resource. On the bottom thread, you see this intellectual focus, and again, correlating chapters of the book that might be useful resources. And then so I did a broad kind of outline, and then I kind of broke it down with some initial ideas of how to build this up into activity plans or lesson plans. And I'm really hoping that someone, I'm hoping that everyone here can take this broad framework and make it pertinent to them and really grow out the lesson plans and things like that. So this is that's the KG through, I think, second. This is 3rd grade to 5th grade. Again, the chapters that correlate and some of the ideas based on the themes that I discussed earlier. And then this is for 6th to 8th grade. And this is for high school, so 9th to 12th grade. This is the kind of specific scope that we came up, but I really do hope that someone kind of takes the baton and fleshes out more lesson plans, thinks about doing focus groups with high school and college students to get more understanding. And that we actually make this point about creating a space in our khutbahs and masajids, spatially and in our discourse. I had another point I was going to add that I thought was really important about the spatial acceptance in the masjid, but we'll just see if it comes up in question and answers, because I do want to leave some time for that. I hope we have some time, Sister Magda.
We have 5 minutes, inshallah.
Okay.
So any questions? I think everybody wants to get a copy of the scope and sequence. I think that's been coming up.
Okay. Sure. I put my email there. I don't know if that's the best way to share it. If people want to email me, I can just send it out to them.
Somebody had posted a website that there's material available for free. I don't know what that material was that he was referring to.
That's the website she mentioned earlier, and the Divine Realities actually, and many other books are there for free.
Okay. Jazakallah khair.
Right. Oh, thank you for sharing that. I think there is a PDF version.
Okay.
That can be downloaded from there.
Okay. So any other questions from anybody for Sister Maryam?
I noticed
they're doing
that
such a good job that they're not.
The email.
I'm
Yes,
sorry.
please go ahead.
Sorry, her email, please.
It's here on the screen, Maryam Razvi Padella
Yes, but we
@gmail.com.
cannot copy it. Can you put it on the chat?
Oh,
Yes.
sure.
Thank you.
I'll put in the chat. Someone in the chat, Sister Maryam, shared about her own crisis of faith. And she pointed out that the foundation that she received from her Islamic school experience really helped navigate her own crisis. I really appreciate you, Hafiz Maryam, sharing that. Jazakallah khair. What do you suggest for getting elders to include youth in the khutbahs? I actually think that we need to talk to youth more, you know, and find out what is important to them. We need to ask them. That's honestly the best, the easiest way to just talk to them. You know, what's going on? What's an important thing? My kids are teaching me things all the time. I have no idea, you know what I mean? Like it's just hard to keep up with the things that they're exposed to, you know, but you have to keep the line of communication open and capitalize on it, right?
And I think if you've never asked them, you'll be shocked by what they tell you. You'll be shocked, one, for how strong they are and how much they know. And you'll be shocked about the things that they know about that you thought they were. I hear parents tell me all the time, oh, our kids are so innocent. They don't know about those things. I'm like, yeah, you haven't had a conversation with them yet.
Yeah, exactly. I think we just really need to talk about that. We need to just talk to them. We need to see them as not, and I think part of it is just a kind of a paradigm shift. Like we have this idea, like we're the adults, you know, they should do what we say and whatever. But we really need to, you know, our kids are smart. They're really smart. I mean, honestly, like when I think about my own childhood and like this next group of kids, I mean, they're really sharp and very intellectually capable, and we need to realize that and appreciate it. I will actually also say about the masjid point that we need to reevaluate how we make space for women in the masjid. I could talk on, and I was planning on sharing this because I felt it was really important, but the ways in which I've been traumatized by masjid experiences, I will just say in summary that I'm glad that those traumatic experiences happened to me as an adult and not as an impressionable child or an impressionable teenager. And the fact that I was able to navigate those traumatic experiences as an adult is because the imam of the masjid where I grew up, you can ask anyone who grew up in that community, any of the girls, he treated us girls like we were queens. I mean, people would say, Mariam, you walk around like you own the masjid. And that is the degree to which I felt comfortable and welcome in the masjid. And I will not accept any less from any.
Sister Mariam, I'm going to see if you can take this last question in like 1 minute.
Okay, sure.
It's a 1 hour answer.
Okay. But the idea of that question was, sorry, which question do you want me to do?
It's okay. How do we communicate with them?
Oh, how do we communicate with them?
What is the best approach?
You know, just open. I honestly, I think that if we just be quiet for a little bit and give them a little bit of time and just say, you know, hey, well, let's go, you know, even it doesn't have to be a big conversation. What did you guys do this weekend? Okay, and then just build from there. Just build really organically and just make it a habit, right? Because when they feel comfortable talking, they will continue to talk. That you will be the one that they come to. I had one student who I actually didn't have much of a relationship with him, but he felt comfortable with me as a teacher for some reason. And he didn't go to the masjid. He came and talked to me about his drug problem. He didn't go to the imam. He came and talked to me, right? So we need to, yes, like a lot of people are saying, just listen, just be non-judgmental. You know, we don't need to be reactive. That's actually what Sister Noor said. What's that?
Be respectful of them.
Yes.
And be honest with them.
Yes.
Alhamdulillah.
100%.
Jazakumullah khair. I know Brother Saad said you took his speech, but I am sure, being from the Qadri family, they're going to come up with a lot more.
Anything.
But alhamdulillah, I'm sure it's going to continue the topic and help complete it, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair for everybody who attended. And Sister Mariam, if you're staying in this track, then you have a 15-minute break, inshallah, to the next session, but stay in the link. And if you're going to another track, you will have to leave this meeting and re-enter with another link from the next track, inshallah.
Mr. Magda, can you remind them about the survey, please?
I will. Can you please copy the link?
Let me
see. Oh, I didn't copy it today. So the link should be copied in each session, and I apologize, I did not put it here. If you get it in the next session or the last one, you can do them all at one time at the end.
I'm gonna copy it now really quick if people will just give me a...
So you can do it after each session, or you can do it at the end of the last session. It's for the full day of workshops, inshallah. Very beneficial, Sister Maryam. Jazakumullah khair.
I hope so. Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity. Jazakallah.
Okay. And Assalamu alaikum. I will have to leave because I'm actually going to the leadership track. Assalamu alaikum.
Okay, it was so good to see you, Sister Magda. Thank you.
You're welcome. Assalamu alaikum.
Like so.
That was incredible, Sister Maryam. Really, really beneficial. And then the materials that you're sharing are a really great foundation.
Thank you so much. I really hope it's of benefit. Thank you.
I'm sure it will
Yes,
be.
Jazakallah so much. It's just wonderful. I loved it. I learned so much today. Thank you so much. Jazakallah khairan.
You're very welcome. Thank you for coming.
جزاك الله خير.
Wa alaikum.